Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the second panel as part of our Dissemination and Implementation Science Speaker Series. I want to briefly introduce myself, the broader goal of the speaker series, and our esteemed panelists who are very grateful to be participating in this series. So my name is Brianna Last, and I'm an assistant professor in the clinical area of the psychology department at Stony Brook University. And I organized this series along with the help of Dr. Joanne Davila, who's also at Stony Brook, as well as the fantastic members of my lab. So special thanks to Laura Jans and Madeline, who have played an immense role in organizing this series. The Dissemination and Implementation Science Speaker Series is part of a project funded and supported by the Academy of Psychological Clinical Science. And the overall goal of the project is to strengthen dissemination and implementation science training across clinical science training programs. As population mental health challenges have become more pressing across the country and around the world, there is a real need to ensure that people can access high-quality, evidence-based mental health services. The question of how to meet this need is one that dissemination and implementation scientists have tried to answer. Since its inception, the field has developed unique methods, theoretical frameworks, and models that can help move the needle of population mental health and ensure that people get the support they need. But training in dissemination and implementation science is not widely available in clinical psychology programs. So the purpose of our project is to leverage the immense capacities, expertise, and resources in already existing programs to spread this knowledge to trainees. So by making this series free and virtual, we hope that it can support everyone who's interested in dissemination and implementation science. So today's exciting panel is called Innovative Research Designs, and it features our esteemed panelists, Dr. Geoff Curran and Dr. Kate Guastaferro. Both Geoff and Kate have been leaders in the field of implementation science and intervention science and have devoted their careers to rethinking and reimagining the traditional research tools we use to assess whether interventions work in the real world. Both scholars are deeply invested in accelerating the translational research pipeline to ensure that we can get evidence-based treatments to people faster and more effectively. And I'm so delighted for them to be joining us today and to hear their contributions. So I'm going to briefly introduce both of our panelists and then let them take it away. So Dr. Geoff Curran is a professor in the College of Pharmacy, as well as the College of Medicine at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. He's also a research health scientist at the Central Arkansas Veterans Healthcare System. Dr. Curran trained as a medical sociologist, and he began his career looking at the complex etiology of substance use disorders and published several papers on the intersection of social and psychological factors in the development of problematic substance use. Later, Dr. Curran became interested in health services research and began to investigate predictors of treatment engagement and outcomes for substance use disorders. And in addition, he simultaneously developed his research interests in the diffusion of innovation in mental health and primary care settings. Dr. Curran has been funded by NIDA, NIMH, DoD, and the VA to develop and test a range of facilitation strategies designed to support the uptake and sustainment of evidence-based practices. He's also the director of the Center for Implementation Research at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, which is a joint entity between the colleges of pharmacy and medicine. The center is devoted to developing and testing implementation strategies across a wide range of services. Dr. Curran is also incredibly invested in training the next generation of implementation scientists. When it comes to training, I'm very aware of the profound impact that he's made on the field. I was just telling him before our panel that whenever I'm collaborating with other implementation scientists, we always have a shared language of calling interventions the thing. And that's all due to Geoff. So it's a real honor to have him to be one of our panelists. And then Dr. Kate Guastaferro is an assistant professor of social and behavioral science and the associate director of the Center for the Advancement and dissemination of intervention optimization at New York University School of Global Public Health. She's an intervention scientist by training, and her work is devoted to the development, optimization, implementation, and evaluation of effective, efficient, affordable, and scalable interventions with high public health impact. She's an expert in the multi-phase optimization strategy, and her expertise is in parent-focused, multi-component behavioral interventions to prevent child maltreatment. Dr. Guastaferro co-led a statewide trial focused on the coordinated implementation of 3 evidence-based child sexual abuse prevention programs. And included in this trial was the parent-focused child sexual abuse program that she developed, piloted, and evaluated. Her current work is focused on the integration of intervention optimization in the prevention of child maltreatment. And she's won several national awards for her work on child development. So thanks so much, Kate. We're super excited to have you. Before our panelists begin, I'm just going to cover some brief logistics and the structure of the panel today. So each panelist is going to speak somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period. I'll begin the Q&A with some of my own questions before opening it up to the audience. I'd ask that all of you hold your questions until that portion, just so that we can have a lively discussion. Should you experience any technical difficulties or have any questions during the panel, if you could chat Laura and Madeline, and maybe both Laura and Madeline, if you could like wave to show people who you are. And if you'd like to view this presentation with closed captions, you can click Show Captions on the bottom bar of your Zoom screen, if that would be helpful to you. And Laura and Madeline will also be monitoring the dissemination implementation email, so dissemination.implementation@gmail.com, should you be kicked off the Zoom for any reasons or have technical difficulties. Okay, those are all the logistics. Without further ado, let's begin with our first panelist. Jeff, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Sharing my screen now, just making sure everybody can see it okay.
Looks great.
And everybody can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm seeing we're starting about, okay, about 11:09 or whatever. I'm going to try to monitor my own time, but I will take any and all nudges. So thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking mostly about this concept of hybrid studies and this idea of studying implementability of interventions. And I often like to start out by just saying thanks to my current funders. These are the folks that are funding my work. I also like to say that I was very fortunate to work part-time for the VA for about 25 years. I recently ended my tour of duty, as they call it. So it's in the past now, but I'm super, super happy for that opportunity. I know that some of you folks have maybe seen me talk before. I usually like to note that I do have a stutter. I also kind of get nervous up here when I'm giving talks, especially at the beginning. Pretty sure I'll calm down after a few minutes, but I just like to let people know. Okay, so that was a really long introduction, and I very much appreciated it, so I don't need to cover a whole lot of this here now. I'll only state that I started doing implementation research in the VA around 1998. So I was doing other services stuff, mental health focused, access, quality, whatever. But in 1998, they formed this query initiative with a pretty cool idea. Hey, let's try to better implement the VA clinical practice guidelines while studying how best to implement them at the same time, which was kind of a pretty early kind of learning health system idea. And frankly, a lot of innovations and some of the staples in our field these days actually come from these early VA researchers. But as Brianna noted, so since then I've been doing a lot of funded work by a lot of other folks, mostly developing and testing implementation strategies in support of an extremely wide range of evidence-based practices and in lots of different kinds of contexts. And I also focus a lot of my own work on methods and designs in the field. And indeed, that's why I'm here today. I also just like to note that I focus almost exclusively all of my work in clinical settings. So, I am a healthcare implementation researcher. And there's a lot of people who work, in public health and in community settings. And frankly, I'm not going to cover this, but some of the hybrid stuff doesn't work super great in that setting. But I'm going to focus mostly on clinical interventions and healthcare settings. I also just like to note, too, that in the past 10 years or so, I've added a personal focus on doing stuff in pharmacies as a place where evidence-based practices are being more and more delivered, and trying to utilize pharmacists in ways to try to support implementation of a wide range of evidence-based practices. I don't know if we have any pharmacists here today. We probably don't, but I always like to plug that that's where I am now. The goals for the talk are as follows. For the most part, I'm going to be talking about these hybrid studies. I'm going to cover these three types that we proposed and still promote. We're going to be focusing mostly on hybrid type 1s today, and I'll say why later. Throughout, we're going to be covering and talking about this concept of implementability of interventions and sort of what actually makes them easier to do and not do. And then at the very end, I'm going to briefly note that hybrid studies are certainly not the only option for trying to make gains, in, speed of trying to get what we know works out there, and trying to make sure that things are scalable and valid with partners. So I'm going to mention just really briefly this notion of designing for dissemination, implementation, and sustainment, or D4DIS as it was called, or as it's called now. But I won't really cover that. So these were the guiding questions which we got from Brianna, for our session, and I think it was fairly obvious to them in asking me that they probably thought that hybrid studies might be one way, not the only way, but one way to try to do these kinds of things, which they wanted us to focus on. How do you optimize efficiency, scalability? How do we speed the process? How do we make sure that our insights are ecologically valid and make sense for folks on the ground? I think hybrid studies are pretty well designed to try to do at least most of this stuff, and that's why I think that I'm here today. Okay, so I guess people have heard about the thing. I'm just going to cover it here real fast as a level set. So when I talk about implementation science and when I talk about hybrids, it's often helpful to just kind of cover this stuff. So when I'm talking about the intervention, the practice, the innovation that is the subject of implementation support, I usually call that the thing. Intervention effectiveness research, which is maybe what a lot of you do more of, is really trying to figure out whether the thing works. Implementation research, our field, if you kind of boil it all down, to me really is about how best to help people and places out there to do the thing, or if we're focusing on de-implementation, to stop doing the thing, or sometimes to stop doing that thing and start doing that thing. Implementation strategies is kind of the fancy word that we've come up with to differentiate, I think, our interventions in our field from the clinical or prevention interventions. But when you get right down to it, this is basically just the stuff that we do to try to help people and places to do the thing. And while we're at it, the main implementation outcomes of most of our work can be boiled down to basically how much and how well do people do the thing. We're trying to get our strategies to help people to do these things well. and as often as we would like. So I'm going to use this language throughout. And why it's important here is hybrid studies look at both the thing and doing the thing at the same time in the same study to varying degrees, and I'm going to cover that shortly. Okay, so let's go to hybrids for a sec. First paper we published on this was in 2012. We did an update paper in 2019 with a little more help. We did another paper in 2022, which was sort of like, hey, it's been 10 years and what's been happening and what did we get wrong and what do we want to change and how would we like things to go in the future. And this was the paper that I think that I made available to people for the series. So looking back at kind of an old slide from the first paper, here's kind of a pipeline, if you will, and I'm just trying to show with a bumpy circle, not a clean circle, kind of where hybrids fit. We're trying to combine research questions from intervention effectiveness research and implementation research in the same study. And in the 10 or 12 years since this stuff, has been out there, there are some folks who are trying to kind of move the circle back some and think more about implementability issues earlier in the process, which I think is great. And I'm going to talk about that some here too. So you might be wondering, well, why hybrid studies? I think for me, the main issue is, can we hurry up, please? Perhaps blending elements of intervention effectiveness and implementation research in the same study can hopefully help us to save some time. We started to get frustrated that it's like, hey, our whole field's job is to like speed the process of what we know works to everybody does it, and the way we're studying it is a problem for that. So maybe there's some ways that we can speed things up. Maybe we can learn about implementability while we're testing interventions. Maybe we don't have to wait for perfect effectiveness data before moving into implementation research and testing strategies. Maybe, for lack of a better term, we can backfill effectiveness data while we're testing implementation and strategies. Oh, and by the way, if we are interested in the question of, well, how do intervention outcomes relate to levels of adoption and fidelity, how are we going to answer that important question if we don't have data from both sides? Okay. I also just like to note too that there were people that were doing studies like this, doing these combinations long before we started speaking and writing about them and coming up with a name. And our first paper was really just trying to bring some attention to these issues surrounding these combinations, give some direction, a few examples of stuff that are what we're talking about, but haven't been called hybrids yet, and also make recommendations on, how to do this. Our next two papers, and there are other papers out there too now, but our two papers, try to give more guidance. Our first paper focused on trial designs, and this was an explicit choice. We were trying to write this paper and it was taking forever. And so people were saying, when are you going to publish that paper so we can cite it? And so we focused on trial designs. We figured that's what most people would try to use these for. And indeed, that is the case. But a lot of other designs are being used, and I'm going to cover that shortly. In our 2022 paper, we kind of backed off like, hey, let's not say hybrid trials because that's not what we really mean necessarily. So we now call them hybrid studies. But the hybrid idea is combining research questions about the thing and doing the thing in the same study. That's the main deal. In our first paper, and since we proposed three hybrid types, hybrid types 1, 2, and 3, real fast. Hybrid type 1s, they are focused on testing the thing, the intervention, and you have a secondary function of trying to, gather information on doing the thing. On the flip side, hybrid type 3, very focused on testing implementation strategies, testing doing the thing, but not at the expense of collecting no data on how the thing is doing under these implementation conditions. So we are gathering information on the effectiveness of the intervention, but not in comparison to some other intervention. Okay. And then there's hybrid type 2, the weirdo in the middle, for the brave, for the not faint of heart, where we're actually trying to test competing implementation strategy interventions in the same study, and sometimes with competing implementation strategies. Other times, though, we might only just do one implementation strategy in sort of a pilot version, and I'm going to cover that shortly. For this talk, we're talking mostly about hybrid 1 studies. As a brief summary, so these studies are often person-level randomized trials of interventions. This is sort of the classic approach to a hybrid 1. Primary outcome, intervention effectiveness measure of some kind, but there is an implementation-focused process evaluation that's part of the study, which is focused on implementability of the thing and trying to understand what we call in our field implementation determinants. The unfancy terms are like barriers, facilitators to doing the thing, okay? Trying to understand the context where this is going to be delivered. These are often mixed method studies. Pretty much got to use a determinant framework. I'm going to cover that shortly. The most important thing here is really, this is not an explicit evaluation of real-world implementation strategies. That's not the bar here, okay? The most important goal here is to try to deliver interventions with fidelity. Some of the strategies are not going to be useful in the real world, and we know this, but we want to study what's happening anyway, because we hopefully can use these data to help us in the future to plan for more real-world strategy stuff. Real fast, hybrid type 3s. These are often cluster randomized studies of implementation strategies. Many of them, most of them compare strategies, sort of in the classic way of doing it. Obviously, the primary outcome is going to be some implementation measure, some summative measure like reach, adoption, fidelity. Intervention outcomes are clearly secondary. At the moment, when you look at protocol papers over the last 5 years, you see a lot of stepped wedge designs. You see some parallel cluster randomized trials. You're seeing some smart happening too. I'm not going to cover designs per se here, but these are kind of the common ways that people do the work here. Depending on the type of intervention, the type of thing, collecting of intervention effectiveness outcomes can be a challenge. For some studies, A1Cs, hypertension, that stuff is in the chart and you have access to it and it's easy and cheap. But for other stuff, like in mental health, for example, sometimes we just don't have easy access to PHQ-9s every 3 months. And sometimes we have to go out and get those data, which can make it harder to do. Cost outcomes are being studied here quite a bit in hybrid 3s, and we're also seeing more and more proposed studies of mechanisms of action of implementation strategies, trying to understand the how and why of they work. And so we're seeing that a whole lot too. Hybrid type 2s, for the not faint of heart. So we're trying to look at interventions and strategies at the same time. It is really important to note that the implementation strategy or strategies that you are going to study in this are hypothesized to be real world ready, okay? Summative implementation outcomes like reach, adoption, fidelity are always measured in a type 2. In our first paper, we talked about basically 2 versions, and these were both trial designs. One was a dual randomized version where patients were randomized to 2 different things and sites were randomized to 2 different strategies, and this can be done. You also can do a cluster randomized trial for both of those things. We also talked about what we called at the time and for a while kind of the pilot version, which was basically a single arm pilot study of an implementation strategies which were thought to be to work in real world, but nested in a person level randomized trial. So at the implementation strategy level, all the places were getting the same strategy. So it's like a pilot test. Okay. We have a new paper that's just out where we compare pragmatic trials with largely hybrid type 2 trials to try to give you a sense of what you might need to change and all that stuff, but I can't really cover that now. A lot of people, though, do hybrid type 2 studies that meet this definition, but it's a single arm on both sides. It's kind of like a program eval approach. It's a QI approach. The thing and the strategies are pretty well wedded together, and it's hard to separate them, perhaps. And so a lot of people do those kinds of studies also. Our focus is on hybrid type 1s. So I'm just going to spend a little bit more time here. I've covered a lot of this stuff already. I would just note that in these studies, from like, how do you do the study? Like, most of the time and money is spent on the trial part. And the implementation focus part is often kind of a smaller part. But as I've noted, the goals of that implementation focused process eval is trying to understand the implementation experience as it happened during the trial. We're trying to learn how the thing might need to be revised for better implementability. And we're trying to get a sense of, hey, what kinds of support might the people and places need to do the thing in the real world? Should we show in this study that the thing actually works? Okay, so implementability, this is a word that I've been throwing around. I thought I made it up about 10 years ago, and it actually wasn't a word, and it might still not be, but my friend Jill Francis helpfully wrote a paper with it in the title, so now it's legit. But it's, basically, obviously, the likelihood that an intervention will be adopted. And I think a lot of it has to do with the characteristics of the thing, but we can't forget about the people and the places. We can't forget about the context, because it's an interaction between the characteristics of the thing and the people and places who are trying to do it. Remember, all intervention effectiveness studies use implementation strategies to support the delivery of the intervention, but we just normally don't call them that. They are normally they are costly, resource heavy. We're paying clinics, we're paying interventionists, we're paying for the care, we're doing frequent fidelity checks, we're intervening when it goes south. And we know that many or most of these strategies used in these studies are not feasible in the real world. That's fine. That's not the goal, but we can learn from them and hopefully cheat forward. I mean, that's the point here, right? We're trying to learn some stuff that we didn't used to try to help us to plan ahead and to go faster. I would say that most of the type 1s that are currently done and funded are still kind of the 80-20 rule, where it's, they're doing a trial. There's the implementation focused stuff is more towards the end. And it's really kind of trying to understand what happened during the trial. But there's more folks now who are trying to do a more intensive pre-deployment look at implementability and trying to devise the components to be more implementable from the start. And some are actually combining this sort of design for dissemination stuff early in the process and then coming back and doing a hybrid one to kind of see how that worked. And I think that that's great. I just wanted to mention too that when you have a small number of sites that are part of your trial, we started to do this, and it works great, where we add what we call naive sites to the hybrid part, where we go off and we collect data not just in the sites where they did the trial, but in sites that likely would be recipients of the intervention should it be shown to be effective, but they actually haven't studied it yet. And that's been super helpful. We think it's really easy to get what I'm calling here double duty from frequently collected process data stuff from trials. These studies are collecting, who's joining the study and who isn't, and how many sessions that they go to, and they're measuring fidelity all of the time. And we can use these measures to learn something about implementability during the trial. And if it's a mixed method study, which most of these are now, you can use some of those data to, like, as a springboard for your qualitative work to dig into some of the implications for the future implementability and what kinds of strategies might be needed in the future. It's really important in this work to collect data from all of the types of folks who would need to be involved in delivering or getting the thing. So choosing your stakeholders, super critical. And I just kind of wanted to note too that, like, we have folks in our center who are starting to specialize in this hybrid one idea. It's kind of been a great thing for people who aren't coming to the field from a clinical discipline, but more from a methodsy one. And they don't care what the thing is or what the context is, but they're really good at this kind of work. And a lot of people do these kinds of studies, and it's working out great. And I think that's kind of a cool model here for that. Okay, I have 1 minute and I am behind, but that's fine. So I have an example here, which I'm not really going to cover. Wait a minute. Or am I? I'll just say this. So we did a study of a very large implementation effectiveness trial, multiple sites, a bunch of clinics, a lot of patients, and we did a lot of qualitative work to try to find out, like, hey, how did it go in the study? We had a interview guide. I'm just going to share this as kind of my last thing. So when you go ask these questions about, like, how did it work and what worked and what didn't, these are some of the things that you kind of learn. In this study, we learned that most of the providers in the participating clinics who had been asked to refer all their patients who were eligible for the thing, a lot of them didn't refer a lot of patients, and some referred nobody. And those who did were already interested in mental health. So it wasn't like an equal referral process. Those who weren't persuaded to refer a whole lot, like, they had been to the trainings about this stuff and they just didn't think it was a good enough idea to take part. So in our lingo, uptake and reach during the trial were not great. Now, the clinics reached the number of participants that they needed for the power of the study. And in the JAMA article, which advertised widely that it worked, didn't talk about this stuff, that actually on the ground, it wasn't adopted great. So we learned that during the trial and could work our way towards, hey, we have to do a better job of trying to work with folks, because from the public health point of view, it didn't work great. And we learned that because of this. Okay, so I mean, I think that's really the value of this kind of thing. I have a bunch more slides. I'm not going to cover them because I'm done now, but I'm going to say design for dissemination. You've heard about this before. There's a sort of the early paper, which I think is great. There's a new one, which gives a lot more guidance, and this stuff meshes really well with hybrid type 1 stuff, and I think you should go look at it. And I'm done. Questions, comments, heckling. Only 1 minute over the 25 minutes to my read, even though the last 10 slides I jumped. So there.
Thanks so much, Jeff. That's great. Maybe we'll save questions to the very end. Really great presentation,
Sure.
and we'll move on to Kate, and then we can sort of come together and ask the audience for their questions.
All right. Are we working all right? Okay, great. So I took furious notes, Jeff, during your presentation. I'm excited for this conversation. Thank you again for having me. I'm talking about a different answer to the question at the beginning about intervention optimization. And I wanted to start by saying that this is going to be really brief overview of this framework and philosophy. There's no chance that I could do it justice in this amount of time. Do my best. And the principle and thinking about intervention optimization, and specifically MOST, I'm very fortunate to be a part of the crowd that is working on that, but the credit really should go to Linda Collins, who is the purveyor and kind of pusher of MOST. So I just wanted to start by saying that. And now I can't click. Okay, perfect. So let's start with this kind of premise. It takes 17 years for an intervention to move from research to practice or policy. And yes, maybe this is an old statistic, but like it's probably not gotten much better. Moreover, only 14% of the interventions that we make actually end up reaching the population that it was meant to impact. So what is going on, right? When we think about the objectives of intervention science and what we're trying to do here, the goal is to build a coherent knowledge base about what intervention strategies are working, who they're working best for, and why they're working. We want to then use that knowledge to develop interventions that have an immediate public health impact. And then we want to keep making improvements in those interventions over time. The way that we have long gone about this is something that we call the classical treatment package approach. And so this schematic works out to be something like this. We go through the literature, we go through some theory, we go through clinical practice, and we pick out every single thing that we think could move the needle on our outcome of interest. And then we package all of those things into the proverbial black box of our intervention. That intervention then gets tested via what we will refer to as an evaluation randomized controlled trial, something like a 2-arm RCT. So any number of interventions have been developed in this way, including some of my own. This is what we're trained to do. However, when we evaluate an intervention using the RCT, we cannot identify the contribution of the individual components to what's happening with our outcome. We don't know if one of those components that we've chucked in the box has any type of impact on another component, whether that is synergistic or antagonistic. We do not know if a component's contribution is worth it in terms of its cost, and not just money, but time or other resources. We don't know if we need all of those things that we found and put into the box. And importantly, and the thing that really gets me fired up, is we don't know what to do next. We don't know how to make it better, faster, stronger, all of those things. So this is kind of a different version of walking through the process that Jeff laid out. We developed this intervention, packaged it in an intervention, tested in an RCT, and the question of that RCT is it effective, right? If the answer is yes, only then are we moving into implementation research. The question there is it scalable, right? And what if the answer is no? What happens? We have to go all the way back to the beginning. In the real world, this looks like we have this intervention, it's not scalable. So I'm going to start making a trade-off between effectiveness and implementability. I might take out some components that are just too complex for some reason to implement. And then doing so threatens the fidelity and the effectiveness of that intervention. So big threat to implementation fidelity. When these interventions are very complex, it increases that risk, but it also means that we are inefficient with our resources. And so we could be leveraging the resources it takes to implement this program differently, to reach more people or to do another thing for folks that they might need. So this, I'm not the first to think this. This has long been in the literature, and this has resulted in several calls for a need for improving the translational science pipeline. We know, like, the NIH in particular has invested millions and millions of dollars in behavioral interventions across any number of disciplines, and those interventions are falling short. They're not reaching public health impact. There's been a call specifically from the NIH for a comprehensive, systematic, and creative approach to revolutionizing translational research. They do not offer an answer to that. I will offer one to you. It is what I will call a translational research framework for behavioral intervention development. And I had an opportunity to work on a paper with a colleague where we define that to be a framework that spans the continuum of the NIH SAGE model, and that has a purpose of systematically developing, optimizing, and evaluating intervention for large-scale dissemination and implementation. So we put together this figure that combines the three frameworks that meet that definition. So that's the MRC, Orbit, and MOST, and map them onto the NIH SAGE model. And this, the only thing that I'm going to kind of ask you to take away from this is that there are multiple frameworks that could be used. And because there are multiple frameworks, there is a high probability of meaning the same thing, but using different language to say that thing. And so read this paper to learn more. Okay, so when I'm talking about optimization, I'm going to offer you a very specific definition. Other models do not, just buyer beware. For me, optimization is not synonymous with optimal. Optimization is used in a lot of different fields and in different contexts, but from a kind of philosophical sense, it's about balancing competing considerations. And so there's, in this space, intervention science, we're talking about intervention effectiveness against minuses, which are likely to be thinking about implementation constraints. Again, key takeaway, anytime you see optimization in a funding announcement or a grant proposal, you're reviewing, reading, ask for a definition, what they mean by optimization. Luke Wolfenden and his team did a Delphi process with researchers and policymakers and practitioners to kind of come up with a standardized definition of optimization in public health. And so their definition I provide for you here. Things I'll point out is that it's deliberate, it's iterative, and it's data-driven. And it's balancing the intervention with implementation resource constraints. All right. So that leads us to MOST, the multi-phase optimization strategy, one of the frameworks that I highlighted. And again, caution that this is an extremely brief and largely insufficient introduction to this complicated framework, right? I will provide you resources at the end. So MOST is a interdisciplinary framework or paradigm, if you will, that is informed by behavioral science, industrial engineering, health economics, decision science, and implementation science. It is a framework paradigm for optimizing multi-component behavioral, biobehavioral, biomedical, social structural interventions. And in MOST, the definition that we provide for optimization is the process of identifying an intervention that produces the best expected outcome in light of key constraints imposed by the need for affordability, scalability, and efficiency. I will note that a component here, if you think of any intervention in your back pocket, it's multi-component. I promise you I could figure out how to break it apart. But a component is anything that can be separated out for study. So what does that mean? First, thing that probably comes to mind to many of us is parts of an intervention. So content, different things that we're going to put together. But a component could also be features that are promoting engagement or adherence in an intervention. So maybe a text message reminder or a MEMS cap. There's all different kinds of ideas there. A component could also be something that's aimed at improving fidelity of the intervention. So instead of focusing on an intervention targeting a person, maybe we're designing a series of components to support the person who is delivering the thing. Lastly, a component can be an implementation strategy, and we could put them together as a bundle to support the implementation of an EBI. I will return to this. So here's that figure kind of broken up differently in how we think about it in most. So again, we're going through the literature, we're figuring out what those components are, but before we put them together in that box, we're going to subject them to something called optimization. It's empirically driven, it's a rigorous randomized trial. The product of that will tell us what to put in the box, what to keep. And so it's simple, but in this figure, that box is now transparent. The reason being, I know exactly how those components are working on my outcome, and I know exactly how they're working together. Then that optimized intervention gets subjected to the evaluation RCT. Lots of folks think that most is anti-RCT. It's not. The empirically based optimization, that's a form of a randomized controlled trial. And the 2-arm evaluation RCT is at the end. So it's there. Okay. When we're thinking about developing an intervention, regardless of the type of components that we're talking about, the intervention, excuse me, the thing that we're trying to make, we want it to be effective, like duh, right? But we also want that intervention to be affordable, meaning that it's not going to exceed whatever budgetary or other kind of cost constraints we might have. So I want to just be really clear that doesn't always just mean money. It could be time, it could be burden, other things. Scalability. I'm actually struggling with this concept right now. I'm being pushed back to define this better. But scalability has to do with the degree to which the intervention can be implemented like widely with fidelity. Let's just leave it at that. You can debate me later. And then efficiency is the idea of not wasting money, time, and other resources. So in most, when we're talking about optimization, it is a strategic balance of these desiderata of components. So intervention ease is achieved by balancing effectiveness against affordability, scalability, and efficiency. Okay, a small soapbox moment. Most is not a method. Most is not an off-the-shelf procedure that you can just plug and play. It is not a particular experimental design. You cannot do a most. This is a framework. This is the schematic of how things get laid out for us. And there's 3 phases that I'll highlight. I think next, nope. Sorry. We've got the preparation phase, which will be very similar to many of us who's trained in the classical approach. You're doing the conceptual model, identifying candidate components, pilot work, stuff like that. The optimization phase is where things are different, and that's that first empirical examination. The research question there is, how do the components work and how do they work in combination? The product of that is our optimized intervention that then we could evaluate moving forward. I want to just quickly mention that there are 2 different types of interventions that are often developed using most. So the fixed intervention is one in which everybody gets the same level of intervention throughout. An adaptive intervention, in contrast, is one that's the level of intervention changes based on the person, the individual's response to a priori specified things at an a priori specified time. The type of intervention that you're developing dictates the type of experimental design that you should choose for your optimization trial. So fixed intervention is best matched with a factorial or fractional factorial experiment. these are appropriate for when you don't know the contribution of each component or what could be removed, or if you have some constraints. And we typically are talking about experiments in the 2 to the k factorial family, meaning that each factor or the experimentation of each component only has 2 levels. It looks something like this. Using the factorial experiment, you are able to estimate the effect of each factor independently. So that would be the main effect of each one of the factors or components that you're looking at. But then you're also able to look at the interactions. And this is, I call this the magic table. So imagine that you have a scenario in which you want to test 5 components, all right? If you were going to test these 5 different things individually, and you wanted to set power at 0.8, you would have 10 experimental conditions, and you would need 2,500 or more participants to do this. You cannot estimate the interactions of those things. Alternatively, you could think about a comparative treatment experiment where you have a shared control condition that you're sharing with those experimental conditions. So you drop down to 6 experimental conditions and down to 1,500-ish participants, but you still can't estimate interactions. So the factorial experiment, the magic, and what you're all going to be like, ooh, is that in order to estimate all of the main effects and the interactions, yes, I have 32 experimental conditions, but I only need 512 people to be fully powered to estimate the main effects and the interactions. See, magic. Extremely briefly, if you were going to develop an adaptive intervention, the SMART or the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial is the best bet. I won't spend too much time on this because of time, but here is what a SMART could look like. Okay, at the end of the optimization trial, you have the empirical data to get the effect of each component on the outcome of interest independently and in combination. And then you have the expected outcomes for each one of the different intervention versions or combination of the components. That allows you to identify which combination or intervention package is going to meet your optimization objective. And that's the balance between effectiveness with affordability, scalability, and efficiency. So I'm not going to go too much into like the weeds of this example, but this is a project that was conducted by Mario Guads at NYU. And the goal of it was to optimize an intervention that would reduce viral load in HIV positive individuals. This is their conceptual model. They identified 5 candidate components. They specify each component targeting a mediator in the conceptual pathway or causal pathway moving towards the outcome of interest. They designed a, so this was a fractional factorial design. So it ended up only having 16 experimental conditions, but they still tested 5 different components. It looks like this. These data are from our new kind of decision-making approach that's led by Jillian Strayhorn, who's also at NYU. It's called DAVE the method, not Dave the person, we like to say. And basically this uses Bayesian statistics to help us identify the balance between the 2 different outcomes, effectiveness and let's say cost. And so these different dots represent the different combinations of the components and those levels, and tells you that to identify which ones strategically balance these 2 things, they'd be on this curve. We can go more into this if you'd like. And again, if we make it all the way through that, then we end up at the evaluation phase where we could do evaluation RCT. But I always like to mention that that doesn't have to be a 2-arm RCT that you're used to. The point is about the research question. And so you want to be able to evaluate your optimized intervention to a suitable control, but you could do a 2x2 factorial experiment and still be able to answer that question. So this is my passion project, I'll say, it's the integration of intervention optimization with implementation science. And I think there's a mutually beneficial opportunity here for these two things to come together. I wrote a paper that lays out the next three things. First, using MOST, it's possible to engineer an intervention that's readily implementable. So we know that there's going to be constraints in our world, right? And those constraints sometimes reduce the effectiveness of our intervention, as I laid out for you. MOST gives you this ability to balance those things. And you could identify interventions that are maximally effective, but that don't reach an upper limit on cost or time or some other kind of quality. MOST can also be used with implementation science to guide the adaptation of interventions in different contexts. And so the premise that I'll present to you here is that the results of an optimization trial can generalize across locations, but constraints might not. So for example, we did a thing where we've got 5 components. We did our optimization trial. In one setting, maybe it's a clinic, Jeff, we have a ability to spend $300 per person to deliver an intervention. Well, the optimized intervention that meets that constraint is comprised of components 1, 2, and 4. Now we go to a different clinic and they've got a different amount of money, less per person to spend. Their optimized intervention using that same data is comprised of components 1, 3, and 5. Okay, last way is I think MOST can be used to optimize the dissemination and implementation of an evidence-based intervention or an EBI. So let's suppose that an intervention is okay, we're fine, but the implementation of it could be improved. And so we think of that EBI as being sealed. I'm not going to play with it, but instead I'm going to play with what goes on around it to support its implementation. And so those implementation strategies are bundled together to become a wraparound intervention. Okay, I'm wrapping up. These guiding questions that you posed to us at the beginning, Jeff offered you one way to think about these things, and I'm offering you another way to optimize effectiveness, efficiency, scalability, affordability, to make sure that what we're doing works in an ecologically valid way, and that we are accelerating our pipeline. And I want to be careful here to say, I'm not promising you a faster time way to get to this, but I'm promising you a way to have more information and more answers to more questions. Okay, so as I said, I did an insufficient job of telling you all the things about MOST. So some resources. I'm the co-director for the Center for Advancement and Dissemination of Intervention Optimization. We have a newsletter. We like to feature work and also new thinking. If you are working in the space of MOST and have a project that could benefit from some consultation, we offer that. And then we have some funding to create the CADIO Academy. And so we offer 2 freely available courses on Coursera that you can approach. One is more of a conceptual kind of thing like I did right now. The second one is more for your biostatistical partners, and it's more methodological in its focus. And that goes along with our asynchronous trainings. We offer asynchronous virtual training, and our applications for January 2025 are open. Thought I would take a moment to share that with you. But I wanted to say thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'm ready for this discussion.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was such a great presentation. So thanks to both Jeff and Kate. Virtual round of applause. Using Kate's optimization definition, I feel like that was enormously effective at transmitting lots of information given the constraints of our panel. So thanks so much. Before we open up the question and answer period to the audience, I thought I would just ask a couple of questions. And I also welcome Jeff and Kate for you both to share your reflections. I know all of us were sort of furiously taking notes. And just for the audience to know, as we're sort of posing questions, if you want to put your questions in the Q&A box, there's like a little button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can sort of jot your questions down there, and other people can vote on questions if one of those resonate with you. You're also welcome to use the raise the hand function, but just note that we are recording this. So if you don't want your face to be posted on YouTube, you may prefer to just use the question and answer button below. So I guess I'm sort of curious about both of your thoughts about how you could sort of bring your work together, because when I was listening to your presentations, I thought about the fact that, you know, we're still using this classical treatment package for lots of our hybrid studies in the field, and that we are using these sort of two-arm trials. And as you've mentioned in your work, Kate, you know, we do this thing where we just try to increase the effectiveness of our implementation strategies at this point by loading on as much as possible to make sure that our interventions work and that we can make people do the thing. And so I'm curious if there are ways that you both can envision, you know, your work synergizing in some way.
Well, yes. And I think it's important to just start by saying people have successfully been awarded grants that use the hybrid effectiveness study language using most. And I think that's awesome. I think there's tons of potential, but I will use this as an opportunity to give myself accountability. I think that there is a need for some work in leaders of both of these two spaces to help people be more successful in the application of it, because most is an implementation science forward framework. And so I think that just means being a little bit crafty to make best use of the hybrid studies. But Jeff, tell me what you think.
Yeah. Wow. So that's a big question. And we probably don't have 2 hours to deal with just that one question, but I assure you that we could talk about it for that long. I'm going to answer it in a couple of different ways. So first, just as a context of sort of implementation science as a field that I grew up in the VA. And I think that some of that context has influenced in a somewhat negative way some of the science of how we go about doing this. In that system, you know, like I said at the start of my talk, we were charged by the healthcare system to figure out how to better implement their clinical practice guidelines to make veterans' health better. And sometimes they might not care a lot about the generalizability. And sometimes they didn't care about parsimony, and they didn't care about, well, we want you to spend some time and look at these components and compare them and try to figure out, you know, who might need, you know, only what. So the first 5 years of my career doing this in the VA, we were throwing the kitchen sink at things in large packages to try to move the dial. And I think that when you're trying to move fast and when you're trying to figure out how to move the dial and your funding and your life depends upon trying to do that, I mean, I think that that's a reasonable approach. It's not very good science. And sometimes the folks that are funding the science don't really care about that a whole lot. They want to move the dial. And so, you know, there's a recent scoping review of implementation strategy trials, and the mean number of strategies per package was 9. And there was not a lot of, well, let's try these two and let's try those two. Now, to our credit, in the past 10 plus years, we're trying to do things like, hey, let's try to start small and let's compare more a basic package and add ones that we know are more costly and take more time. But our field is one that was sort of merged together and formed by a bunch of different people from a bunch of different places. And we were trying to go fast, right? Go fast, go fast. 17 years. And I think that we've sort of missed a lot of opportunities to scan and learn from other disciplines or those that weren't sort of at the table when we got started. And I've seen this over and over again where it's sort of like, oh, we need to integrate behavioral economics into what we are doing. And then last year, colleague and friend Danny Almiral was, coming to my class to talk about smart designs and Macy stuff, and he said, "Look, I don't want to talk about that. What I really want to talk about is how our field stinks about basic intervention development and how much we got to learn from some of these other folks because we're doing stuff wrong." So, like, yeah, our field needs to talk more to other fields that have already figured stuff out, and we just didn't know it yet or didn't care yet. And so I think that that's happening in a lot of different areas at the same time. Like Kate said, a bunch of people have been doing, mosty stuff in our field for a while. I don't think it's like hot. I don't think it's like happening a lot. I think we need, just like Kate said, to try to get some leaders together, and people have tried a bit, but to focus on this issue and to try to help our field integrate this more. And I do think that there are ways to integrate the ideas around sort of hybridness with, the most framework, and it could be great. So, I mean, I think people are kind of individual teams and people are getting there on their own, but I think our field and our fields kind of need a collective push to try to help them to do it. Does that make sense, Kate?
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, we don't want to spend 2 hours. Brenna, tell us what else.
Yeah, it's a big question, Brianna.
Well, maybe an opportunity for future collaborations.
Already talked about it.
Excellent. I'm great. I'm very happy to hear that. This question actually is a little bit more targeted to Kate, but I'd actually be curious, just from your experience doing this work in the field, Jeff, if you also have thoughts. When I think about components for these really complex psychosocial interventions, there's a degree to which there's a necessary sequencing. Some components build off of each other. Sometimes component 4 doesn't make sense unless you've done 1, 2, and 3. Or there are sort of like sleeper effects where like you need 1 before you do 4. But really 1 only kind of activates after you've done 2, 3, and I guess I'm thinking about the fact that, and I'm guilty of this too, we try to draw parallels from other fields to learn from other fields, like technological innovations, where you're iterating an extremely small feature of an app or a product, and it's easy to separate those things out. And I guess I'm curious if some of those parallels may break down sometimes when we're talking about these complex psychosocial interventions, or how you think about the way in which there's a lot of embeddedness of of the components of these interventions.
Yeah. So you're coming in hot with these very big questions, just so you know. But broad strokes, here are my thoughts. I would argue that not everybody knows what you just said for certain, and instead just has this like gut or an anecdotal kind of thing, in large part because the study designs that you're using aren't allowing you to necessarily draw that conclusion. So it's very common, and I politely will push you to be like, do you know that? Or are you sure? And the questions about sequencing or the dependency of the components, that's an important one. So in thinking about most and components, you have to be able to separate them so that they can be manipulated independently. So if you ethically or whatever know that these 2 different components cannot happen without each other, then that changes the granularity of the component that you're going to manipulate. And that's fine. Like you can get creative about those things. And you can also order and do sequencing. You just have to be sure that like the combination of the components still makes sense. So it's actually one of my favorite things to do with folks is we make your conceptual model, got your intervention design, and then we translate that to the experimental design for the optimization trial. And often I would say like 8 times out of 10, we have to go back to the conceptual model because of these things that people realize about the components. So yeah, this happens. I think there's ways to be creative about it, but more often than not, I think that we don't empirically know as much as we think we do.
Yeah, I would just say that from like the implementation science side and how we have normally approached this stuff, we get presented with a lot of bundles of multi-component interventions. And, you know, when we get told a whole lot about, yeah, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 has to happen in that order. You know, I think that with some of the regular stuff that we are able to do around fidelity measurement and monitoring, and doing some qualitative stuff, which is very common, like in hybrid type 3s, all of our studies have like qualitative after trial looks at high and low performers. And, you know, we try to ask people like, hey, so how did this go? And, you know, did you actually need all the 9 steps? And did anybody skip to 4 after 1? And, you know, and so there are sometimes quantitatively where we can show like, hey, remember when you guys were really, really like keyed on like fidelity has to be super like this or else it's not going to work. Well, some of our studies can show like, yeah, you guys got about half fidelity and people are freestyling like crazy. But you know what? The clinical outcomes weren't that different. So some of the stuff that you think are really important, we just showed that they're not. Now, we didn't like factorially pull it out and piece it, but we have been able to show like fidelity to all the stuff that you think you need, you actually probably don't. And some of the qual can help us to understand the people on the ground who might say, yeah, component 4 is too costly. People hate it. So we just dropped it. But it didn't seem to matter. Right. So like some of the stuff we observe, not like we observe what people did and what happened. It's not an experimental manipulation to actually prove it. But sometimes we're able to get a sense of what might be important about the bundles and what might not be.
And then you can take that information and design another study to test that. I
Yeah,
don't want to discredit what you're saying. I think
exactly.
that's a wonderful starting point.
Yes.
And I also just want to say, like, sometimes if you're not willing to break it apart or you're not willing to lose something, then the what I have just tried to sell you is not for you, right? Like you have to be willing to let go. And just that's an important thing that could help folks choose whether or not this is the right approach.
You know, in the implementation research side, healthcare payers and healthcare systems really don't want to spend more than they need to get the outcomes that they want. They don't want to spend money on 9 component strategies and pay psychiatrists to drive around the country to make sure that like the collaborative care, you know, for depression is happening in, you know, primary care everywhere. So like people want to know the most parsimonious way to get the job done. And I think there are varying ways to do it. You know, we've been trying to break up these packages in ways that seem to make sense, sort of low effort and low cost, whatever, to sort of cheat at this and, you know, look at not sort of factorial, you know, looks, but more sort of theoretical or otherwise selected packages which we compare. So you get at it a little, but I do think that this idea of trying to figure out, well, what do we actually need, you know, is sellable, or could be sellable. I mean, I think when you throw up a table where there's like, you know, 27, you know, different combinations, I think you can scare people off. And, so there, likely needs to be some conversations there, about how to do this that might make these ideas, open to a wider audience. Implementation science, we have to work really hard to partner with people on the ground who are willing to allow us to study this where they are. Part of why we do a lot of stepped wedge is because they don't want to be randomized to the strategy that we think is worse, and they simply refuse. And so, I always say that in our field, our research designs, are the best ones that our partners allow us to do. And sometimes it's not what we would have wanted.
Yeah, that was a great answer. So I'm seeing some questions in the chat or in the Q&A area. So I'll start kind of going with those because they seem really pertinent. So one person is excited to learn about factorial designs and wants to know about where they can learn more. That is one. And then another question is, between the use of hybrid studies, which emphasize efficiency, and most, which emphasizes information, what are potential limitations of either focus when implementing a thing in community-based settings?
I'm struggling to fully understand the question to answer it. I don't know, Kate, if you want to start, which might get me going.
So yes, so let's just see if this helps. First to say that I think both the hybrid study thinking and the thinking in most, they both are prioritizing efficiency. It's just kind of the what and the how in that. And so again, I don't really want them to be seen as competing in any way here. They're very much complementary. And so the end of the question has to do with potential limitations of either when you're implementing a thing in a setting. And so I guess the product of using a hybrid study or developing a strategy using most, you've taken into account the limitations of implementation. And so when you go to scale, that's kind of already balanced and in there. I'm struggling though.
Or I mean, you would hope that it would be, but after you go out and test it, you'll find out whether you did a good job of noting those and addressing them. And it has been my experience that we're seldom right the first time that we throw strategies at something. So
yeah, that brings to mind, Kate, you mentioned struggling with scalability. I guess I'm curious if you had some additional thoughts on scalability and sort of what your thinking on this has been.
I'm sorry, if that was to me, my internet dropped for a moment. You're asking me more about my scalability problems?
Yes, yeah. Sort of what you mentioned in your presentation that you're sort of wrestling with the idea.
Well, I had an opportunity last week to do a research and practice with implementation science colleagues, and they made me realize that when we talk about scalability, it's really we meaning the greater most people. We're really talking about attributes of the intervention as opposed to thinking about scaling an intervention up and reach. And there's some lack of clarity between those two words. And so scalability and scale up are not interchangeable. And I think in prior writing, it has been a little wonky. And so, words are important and we just need to get to be a little bit more precise. And I think the more that most is applied in different settings and different contexts, we're finding more nuances with words. So Jeff highlighted the kind of reliance or heavy incorporation of behavioral economics in our thinking in most, and that changed the way we talk about efficiency completely, because that means something very specific to that discipline. And so I think maybe just like one takeaway or positive thing about what we do is that it is continuously evolving and it's not a fixed science, right? Like we are continuing to iterate and innovate about what we do.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I'll throw a wrench in here too. So a lot of times we talk about scaling up, which is sort of trying to do the same thing with the strategies that we just tested with shows that we can spread it okay and with fidelity. And so then we try to scale up into more of this, the same intervention in the same kinds of places. We have a colleague named Greg Ahrens who talks about scaling out, which is this notion of like, and we do this all the time, where it's like, hey, we have an evidence-based practice that seems to work, with this population in this context for this behavior, but we want to scale that, but we want to test it in, a new population or a new context, or we actually want to take the same idea, the same intervention, but try to see if it works with a different health behavior, and we might want to try to do those all at the same time. And so like, and we want to go fast, right? Because we're trying to like learn from what we know works over here, and we want to try to revise and then, go out there and try it like this. Because we're making these kinds of changes in the target of the thing, the population of the thing, and or the place where the thing happens, how much do we have to start over from scratch? Or how much can we learn about, like, how much faster can we go? What other shortcuts can we take? For example, stuff we talk about in our field all the time. It's like, if we know what the mechanisms of actions are of the thing, then we know we're not messing with those. We can maybe gallop forward with new populations and new contexts anyway, and not have to go back and start from scratch. But these are, there is no, it is understandable that like the theme of the upcoming big D&I meeting in December is this notion of speed, right? And it's not just fast. Like everybody needs to go faster, but it's also like, actually, sometimes we probably should slow down, right? So I think a big thing for our fields, and I think we get into this with hybrids where we're, our whole thing is like, let's go. Enough already. I don't want any more trial. We don't need a trial for people with green eyes. Let's go. Let's get people to do the thing. I got to retire soon. I got stuff to do. I want to make some more progress. But then there's other people saying, hey, slow down. Hey, let's not, garbage in, garbage out. And we could be doing some stuff that we're going to find out later actually was not the thing we should have been doing because we were trying to go so fast. So if we slow down over here for a minute, we could make longer term better gains. As a field, I think we're wrestling with this quite a bit. And I'm in the fast camp by default because I'm impatient, which maybe is not great, but that's just where I am.
Yeah, that was a excellent and entertaining kind of summary of like some of the tensions in sort of, thinking about how these different approaches are in dialogue with each other. So that was very helpful. Thanks, Jeff. Just for the sake of time, I'm gonna just close us out with some announcements. I just want to, before I do that, thank Kate and Jeff enormously. Another virtual round of applause for amazing presentations. Thank you for sharing your insights. We're really lucky to have you.